to the August ABCD-GIS presentation. I'm Jeff Blossom with the Center for Geographic Analysis, and today we are happy to have Peter Damrosch as our speaker. Peter graduated from Yale and then spent several years in Amman, Jordan, teaching high school, and kind of got into mapping out there, and now he's doing mapping for the Amman transportation system. And soon, actually, in a matter of weeks, we'll be embarking off to graduate school at Yale and MIT. And so for a dual degree that maybe you can tell us a little bit more about. But with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Great, thank you. It's been really wonderful attending everyone else's talks this year, so great to be able to now share a little bit of what I've been working on. Excellent. So yeah, I graduated from college in 2012 and pretty promptly moved to Jordan, where I lived for 3 years total. Oh yeah, let me get to the major theme of the talk. The overall project for the last year and a half, 2 years, has been to try to help map public transportation, develop better information, turn it into tools. And along the way, started out in the data side of things, trying to collect data on where buses go and how long they take and how much they cost. And pretty soon realized that looking at anything in isolation is a pretty poor plan. And that the major thing you need, or the major thing our project needed, was a sort of holistic approach of how do we have transit data improve our software, how do we have our software improve our relationships with people around the city, how do we have our relationships improve our data, these kinds of feedback loops to better projects. So this is the sort of general pattern relationships we'll explore. My background was as a Middle East Studies major in college. And when I graduated in 2012, I moved to Jordan, right here on the eastern side of the Mediterranean. I was teaching high school history for 2 years at an English language boarding school outside of Amman. And then in my third year, I moved to Amman proper. This is the view from my roof. And I had my goals for the third year were just to get better at Arabic. My Arabic was pretty broken at the time. And I was like, I don't want to leave Jordan until at least I can have some kind of conversation. But pretty quickly after moving there, I started taking public transportation around from New York City, like buses. And it was also a good way to explore the city. And one of the things I encountered, as I think most people encounter, is just sort of a world of opaque confusion when you first try to take on public transportation in Amman. There are no publicly available informational resources, at least no sort of centralized resources. The resources that are really there are all in the minds of thousands of bus riders. And as I was trying to navigate the system and learn more about how do you get around the city and what are the best buses to take and where should I go to pick them up, I came up with this project of thinking, well, maybe someone could use this information if I collected it on my own. With very modest goals, not that this would turn into anything, but maybe make a website or something to hold a centralized resource of public transportation info. Just as a little bit of background on public transportation in Amman, there are three major kinds of vehicles. There are big buses, like what you might see around here in Boston. There are mini buses called coasters that fit 18 to 20 people. They often have someone who helps kind of wrangle passengers in, collect money, make sure everything moves smoothly. And then there's also these shared taxis, which are just a normal size taxi, but they run fixed routes like a bus does. And this sort of combination of systems is what makes up the overall transportation system, which is somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 different bus routes. It's amazing that I've been working on this for a year and a half, and I still don't have an exact number. There are officially listed 350, but which ones of those are actually running, and if they're running, how frequently? These are some of the weeds you start to get into. There are dozens of different private operators. A private operator could be a big company that has hundreds of buses. It could be you and your brother that have a small family, couple of buses, and you make your money that way. It's a pretty regulated system. The government gives out franchises to run a route. If you want to go from A to B, you'll get a monopoly on running that route. And the government will enforce those monopolies. So they'll try to give you your specific route to run. And in exchange, they also fix the fares according to sort of formula to try to keep them sort of in their mind fair or inexpensive. So how do you navigate this system with hundreds of routes, frequencies that vary wildly? Sometimes a bus will come every 10 minutes, other buses every hour and a half, different prices, different speeds. Well, the vast majority of people use word of mouth to get around, which actually works in a lot of contexts, in a lot of ways, right? You go to a friend and say, hey, how do I get there? And they tell you, oh, this is the best bus to take, but if it's not coming, take this bus, right? Or if it's raining, right, you really might want to try going that route because there'll be a lot of traffic over here. Word of mouth is just an amazingly textured way of getting around the city, right? Because you get a lot of information, you get it customized to what you're looking for. And understand sort of where the word of mouth system thrives, you want to get a little bit of Amman's history, which just not too long ago, Amman was an incredibly small town. In 1905, 1906, the Ottoman census, I think, had Amman at about 5,000 people. After World War I, first king of Jordan chose Amman to be his capital, and it grew a little bit. But even up to 1948, there were only maybe 50,000 people in Amman. But then you have 1948 and the first wave of Palestinian refugees coming in. You have 1967 and a second wave of Palestinian refugees. Just have natural population growth, urbanization. Today it's up to 4 million people. But 50,000 to 4 million is a really quick jump. And there are certain systems that perhaps work better in a 50,000 person environment than they do in a 4 million person environment. Word of mouth being one of them. That in a smaller, more intimate place with fewer buses to navigate, it works really well. 4 million people, maybe we need something else. In parallel to what I was doing, there are a lot of projects around the world at the moment that are trying attempts to sort of crowdsource, or one term that this group in Dhaka, Bangladesh uses, flock source, where you train a flock of people to sort of all use the same system and methodology, and you go have your flock go out and collect data. And one is in Nairobi, the Digital Methodologies program, one in Bangladesh. They've really broken ground on some good ways to officially go use cell phones to collect information. A lot of what I was doing was sort of drawing from these other projects. So initially just started by myself with a cell phone. I would just go somewhere new and try to get lost, right? Try to get as far out of my comfort zone as I can, go somewhere new, and ask people, how do I get back to such and such a place, and get some recommendations on a bus or a shared taxi to try. And I would record the route with a GPS and then critically talk with people. I found drivers just to be incredibly wonderful. I mean, they're driving all day. It can be a boring job, a stressful job, and I think they like to tell you a little bit about what they're doing. And to get that extra information, right? When's the first bus of the day? The last bus of the day? How frequently do they run? What's the price? Does it ever change? Those kinds of questions. And these two kind of, the objective physical system and the subjective, here's what a bus rider or a driver would tell me, formed the basis of what I was doing. Just the Google My Maps, just to throw everything up there, mostly to hold myself accountable, right? Let me have some kind of thing on the internet so I can really feel like I have to keep track. And the initial style really tried to mimic the word of mouth or incorporate aspects from the word of mouth system. So when you clicked on a bus route, it would give you a paragraph of text that would have the kind of information a friend would tell you, right? This is a really good bus if you're trying to go here, but if you're trying to go this other place, maybe try, this alternative. And it would include a picture of the bus and that kind of thing. The idea wasn't to throw out this system that provides a lot of useful information, but centralize a little bit, right? Have some kind of common resource. I really wasn't getting all that far on my own, right? Just one person trying to ride a bus all the way to the end and back takes a while. And the project really took off when I partnered with, or learned about and joined, a couple other Amman organizations that were operating in the public transportation space. The first is this academic research center called the Center for the Study of the Built Environment that had been doing a study of public transportation, kind of architecture, think tank, changing in urban planning and doing more in city form. Then there was also a public transportation advocacy group called Ma'an Nasl, or Together We Arrive. And they had been starting the Arab Spring as sort of people's voice organization, right? To push the government, have better changes. And they chose public transportation as one of their initiatives. And then a graphic design firm called Syntax that actually ended up designing the map itself. And the little effort that I was doing became much, much richer when, teaming up with people actually from the city with, interest and networks of volunteers. And one of the first kind of questions that's I think really foundational was, do we even need a map? Right? I mean, I was just talking about how word of mouth sort of works, right? And is a map the right way to address some of the problems we had? And this is where I really benefited from partnering with these other organizations. The Center for the Study of the Built Environment have been doing this study of public transportation from the user's perspective, and it laid a really foundational understanding of how do people use public transportation, what works and what doesn't. And I continually draw on some of the results from the study, but one of which was that even really veteran users of public transportation in Amman, if they have to go somewhere new, will take a taxi. And the basic reason is if you're going from work to home every day, you'll put in the effort to find out, all right, how do I do that? How do I get from home to work? Because it'll save you a lot of money. But the initial cost in just going somewhere new can be an hour of your time. I mean, really, to figure out how to get somewhere new, you ask Wendy. Wendy doesn't really know. She tells you Jeff. You go ask Jeff. Jeff says, well, why don't you go over to this bus stop and ask someone? And it's just, there's a really high entry cost. So that was interesting to see that even if you take the bus every day, right, you might pay the extra cost of a taxi just to not have to deal with that whole system. And that's just for people who are regularly used to the bus, right? What about the people who don't take the bus? People for whom this opaque system is a little intimidating. But more than that, the head designer at Syntax, the graphic design firm, had this phrase that I love, where he talked about how people in Amman need a visual vocabulary to use when talking about public transportation. I mean, there's so many ways you can improve transit in Amman that facilitating that conversation is really important, but how do we have that conversation without some common vocabulary for what does the system look like? What neighborhoods are served well and which ones aren't, right? If there are redundant lines, maybe where are they and where can we consolidate them? And so this idea of a visual vocabulary sort of prompted what was about a 4 or 5 month design process where one of their designers from this graphic design firm, they took on the project entirely pro bono. This was a graphic design firm that believes that design has a higher civic purpose. And so they'll go and work for commercial clients, but they would also put some of their time just into how can we help the city. And I worked with this fantastic designer named Ahmed Sabah, who, the early drafts were just about kind of feeling out the structure of the city, right? What are the main roads, what are the lines, where do we sort of see the literal geography, and how do we translate that into a schematic that can be a little bit more, perhaps, easier to see with certain straighter angles than if you tried to have a perfectly literal geographic system. The final result was this map, which I think I have a paper copy of. Yeah. It folds up really small. And this represents about 70 routes in Amman. We collected data on 96 routes and then sort of tried to choose from that a central core. And we try to cover, as much of the central cities you can, but you just make a ton of choices when you're making a map, right? I mean, how much information to include, what to leave out. This is really a subjective work on the part of, the collective hive mind of the group. And one thing I just want to point out, the name up there, Hatutna, means our lines or, our routes. And this is something, again, the designers were really, really smart people. We're talking about how this was a volunteer effort. We had probably a dozen volunteers who went out and rode routes collecting data. There's going to be inaccuracies. There are going to be things that are wrong, that aren't, as good as they ought to be. And part of that was, well, let's not deny that. Right? Let's have this brand be authentic, right? I mean, this is a kind of group effort that is tagline, nest to nest, from the people to the people. And part of the effort was not just to help users directly, though that's a huge benefit, but also to push the government a little bit more, right? I mean, we had a couple dozen volunteers working for a few months, a graphic design firm, and all of a sudden we can create something useful, potentially useful. And one of these questions that was always hanging around was, well, why hasn't the government already done this? Or why haven't the bus operators done that? And that's the sort of question I've been exploring more this year. It's pretty, after many, many hours of just sitting on buses endlessly, it was pretty cool to see someone actually hold a physical product. For a lot of those early months, there was no guarantee that seat time was ever going to mean much. And yeah, so this was one of our major questions, which is why didn't anyone else do this? If no one else did that, is that indicative of this didn't need to be done, right? Was this just a foreigner coming in and being like, you guys need a map? And like, we don't need a map, right? That is a totally plausible reason. But I think as talking with a lot of people and learning a lot, we saw, if not the need for a map, then some informational source. And that in the absence of informational sources, it's really interesting to see how people get by. I had a former student, Ward, who I was teaching when he was a high school student, then he graduated to university, and he took the bus every day to get to college. And he just came up with what I thought was a pretty fantastic system where he would have to leave his house every day at 6:30 a.m. And the bus would sometimes come at 6:30, sometimes 6:45, sometimes 7:15. It would just come somewhere in that window, and he was just standing outside his house for 45 minutes early in the morning every morning. And in the absence of good information, this is what you have to do, right? I mean, you can't miss class, you just have to spend that time. So he befriended the regular morning bus driver, got his number, and then would call him every morning when he woke up. And he would say, like, "Hey, Ahmed, where are you?" And I would say, "Oh, Ward, like, good talk. I'm 20 minutes away." And would give him the update, right? Here's how far away I am. And that's a really good system for a single person. I mean, it really gave him the information he needed, which is, can I sleep in? Can I eat breakfast? Or do I have to hurry outside? And again, that's just the sort of these little indications here and there that you really do need something as a user of public transportation more than what was available. But it's also not particularly feasible to have thousands of people all calling the bus driver. Feasible, maybe. Safe, maybe not. But this still begs the question, so why haven't people done this? And I think there are a lot of different answers for why the various bus operators, governments didn't do it themselves. But the kind of overall answer in conversations that I would have with people in the Amman municipality, with people who are running buses, was everyone seemed to think this was a fine idea, a good idea, but not a priority, right? The idea of having better information, helping their customers get around, that was maybe priority 12 or 15, right? And they had all these other issues to worry about. Well, from the angle I was coming, this was hugely important, not just to help individual users use the system, but to help us understand the system as a whole, right? I mean, there were all these conversations in Amman about putting in a bus rapid transit system, which is where you have dedicated bus lanes, and it's a huge new kind of infrastructure investment, without us knowing, where do the buses go and how often do they run. And so these this informational understanding of the city, one of the other groups, the one in Bangladesh, had called it infrastructures, right? So you have your urban infrastructure, your built environment, but then you also have these informational understandings of how the city works. And it seemed like those informational understandings are incredibly valuable, yet aren't being developed. So I had sort of two questions that I'm still chewing over, and these are things where I'd love to get your thoughts and contributions on. The first is, if this kind of data, particularly in its open format and its available format, is really valuable, how do we demonstrate that value in real concrete ways, right? So it goes from priority 15 to priority 4 or 2 or 1. And then a second different question, but related in some ways, is there are a large number of tools and methods for collecting transportation information, for using it, that have been developed in just very different cities. A lot of the tools and methods developed in Boston just wouldn't work in Amman for real reasons. And this perhaps is part of the barrier to why these tools haven't been invented before, where there's a whole body of knowledge that just doesn't click well in Amman. And so you go, well, how much do we want to develop everything from scratch, which can be really custom fit and tailored, but also we don't want to keep reinventing things and putting all our time in. So how do we find a balance between importing what works, adapting it, but also developing local methods and means? So the first kind of overall idea we came up with is, why don't we make not just one tool, let's make a few tools. Let's make a trip planner, a map, a system-wide understanding of the system, and then a GTFS, which I'll talk about in a second, to try to show off the value of transit information to a lot of different kinds of groups. Because our thought was, this data is valuable. There's a quote I love, it says, the value of open data is not in its use, but in its reuse. One of the things we want to try to push is collecting this data is potential for use and reuse and reuse. And let's see if we can build a coalition of interest, right? Or a broad-based number of groups who could be interested in this project. And this is basically over the last year has been turning that raw information into these kind of 4 tools and hopefully more. So the first is a GTFS. This is the way people structure public transportation information. I think Stefan, is it Wunsch? Who gave the talk? Anyone? Stefan Bunch gave this great talk in the fall, October, on how he's been using GTFS from Boston to create some pretty cool maps. GTFS is a system developed by Google and the Portland Transportation Agency for organizing transit information. They say, let's come up with one standard way to organize public transit information so that we can share and use the same data structure across different platforms, across different applications. It's a really smart, it's one of those things that's so simple that it's really elegant. I mean, it's a very lightweight, smart system. It's just a series of CSV files. And the main file is a list of all the stops in the city. You have a list of stop 1, 2, 3, 4, and you put the coordinates next to it, right? The latitude and longitude next to each of those stops. And then you represent transit information by saying, this bus goes to stops 1, 12, 47, 893 in that order. That which stops does the bus go with a schedule of how long does it take. It's a really great system if you can make it, because you can tap into all these other tools that people have made. There's just a couple of problems. Amman doesn't have fixed stops or schedules. The general transit feed system is based really around fixed stops and schedules. That's how it represents tools. And you can get to see if Google had been designing this way of representing transit information in Amman, they wouldn't have designed the system. But if you want your public transportation system to be up on Google Maps, you have to develop a GTFS. But how do you develop a fixed stop system if someone can get on and off anywhere? In fact, that's one of the things people like about public transportation in Amman. I mean, it's perhaps inefficient because you have to keep pulling over all the time, but also gets you exactly to where you want to go. Well, there's some pretty cool open source tools that people have developed. This is a software development firm, Conveil, that has an awesome open source model. They contribute to public transportation open source programs, and they make their money by getting hired by people like the World Bank to then implement the tools. But everything they create, they put up on their GitHub. It's entirely open source. And then there's one tool, Geom to GTFS, or Geometry to GTFS, where you put in a GIS shapefile of just lines, and it simulates stops. So you'd say, this is the line where our bus goes, and it says, great, we'll put in a fake stop every 200 meters. It's a stop only in the sense of how the GTFS uses it. And then it links all of those stops, and it outputs like that for you, a GTFS. I probably spent like 98% of the time on data collection, all that, and like 2% of the time just plug it into their program, and all of a sudden we had a GTFS of sorts. It doesn't get over the scheduling problem, because there's definitely no schedule in Amman, right? You can't be like, oh, the bus is coming at 2:30, and that's still a problem. And these are what we're trying to work on, which is the data and software development need to go hand in hand, because we need something better. But once you have a GTFS, you can just create a ridiculous number of very cool and useful tools. So the first one we made I made as a kind of demo of a GTFS is a system-wide map to see how the system as a whole performs. And I should say as a whole. These are the 96 routes that we collected data on, and there are many more that we're missing. And we also, most of our timing data is just from interviewing people. We said, hey, how often does the bus come? Which is really imprecise measure, it's subjective. But this whole idea between relationship data and software is, let's start with something. Let's put out some kind of tool, and let's hope that stimulates interest to collect more data and then refine the tools. That's going to be iterative, so that the tools we produce are weak in the beginning, but can become stronger, is the theory. So this is an example centered around the City Hall, the Amman municipality. And in this first gray level, you can see where you can get in 0 to 14 minutes. The green is where you can get in 30 minutes, the blue in 45 minutes. And it gives you a sense for the fabric of public transportation. You can see the certain corridors where the bus is just speeding along, and you get really good service. And then you can see places not too far from a central road that are really left out of the picture. Again, this is the picture we've created, right? So it's the partial picture, but gives you a sense of what you could create with better data. If you switch perspectives, this is from a neighborhood, Guesme, which is a poor neighborhood, Palestinian, not as well served, and it's got a much more restricted potential area that it could reach. The program where I was using is Open Trip Planner, which is an amazing open source planner where you put in, how do I get from A to B, and it'll give you good routing for that. But it also does how do you get from A to everywhere else in the city. And it does it lightning fast. I'm blown away by people who create algorithms for a living. And it gives you this really kind of, someone called this a Japanese cloud painting picture of the city. So the idea behind this tool was, and I showed it to, yeah.
Is this routing based on only your bus routes or based on the street network of the city?
Both, yeah. So it takes OpenStreetMaps, which provide street network data, which is critical for transportation because you have to walk to the bus, right? So you need the street paths, and then uses the GTFS to provide the rest of the transit info. It has car options as well, which is would be just using the street data. And we'll get to, yeah.
I mean the zone of the accessibility.
Yeah.
Is it based on bus or is it based on the street network?
Both, yeah. So there's the buses in terms of just where the buses go, but the walking component of a bus trip depends on the street network. So for example, right here, there may not actually be a bus. So you need the street network to provide you with where you're going to walk to get to the bus. So the street network, not so much for automobile travel, but for the pedestrian access. Yeah, it uses both. Those are the two main inputs: is OpenStreetMap, street network, and then the GTFS. And OpenTripPlanner fuses the two into a single graph that it uses to traverse.
This is a transit shed.
Yeah, exactly. And you can switch to do walk sheds or car sheds to see what are the different areas you can access. A real accessibility map doesn't show how far you can go. It shows what you can access, how many houses, how many jobs, how many schools. And that's what I wanted to make. But it kind of brings up a problem that I was vaguely aware of at the beginning of the project, but really started to appreciate, which is transportation data can't exist in isolation. You need to have so much more data to support transportation. You need data on things like jobs and housing and healthcare. You need a road network, right? You need elevation data. You need so much more information to make transportation data actually useful. Because transportation is, we call it an intermediate good. It's the economic term, right? You don't want it for itself. You want transportation because it helps you get to things, right? I take the bus so I can get to my kid's soccer game, right, or to work. And you need what's on the other end of that trip. And this has been a lot of challenge, which is collecting transit data is one large challenge, but then you kind of want, once you have it, you want everything else, right? You want to be able to really bring it to its full potential. So for example, here's the OpenStreetMap road network for Amman. Just to give you a sense of, the crowdsourced platform, OpenStreetMap, really amazing somewhere like Boston, weaker in Amman. If you take street names, for example, there are a few street names, but the vast majority of streets don't have street names yet on them because no one has uploaded them on OpenStreetMap. So the early version of the trip planner we were making, which is built, OpenTripPlanner assumes you have really good street data, was just saying, oh, you want to go from road to road, right? And I was like, well, that doesn't help at all, right? And these are the kind of things where you need this whole ecosystem of data. To go back to that term infrastructure, right? You need multiple structures coming together to really make a good product or a good app. This was something the government of Amman actually gave us. They gave us, their GIS department gave us their whole street network with names in Arabic and English for the whole city, 20-something thousand streets, everything. One or two problems. The first is they wouldn't give us house numbers. So they give us the streets. You could get Cambridge Street or Mass Ave, but they wouldn't give us where 23 Cambridge Street was, where 107 Cambridge Street was. And it was a very interesting process. I spent a lot of days in the Amman municipality. To some degree, it's by no means a monolithic entity. There are people who are so supportive of open data, of what we were doing. The head of the transportation department, Ivan Smadi, was just really go to bat for us and help us get better information. Other departments, though, believe that data costs money to collect, it costs the government money to collect, and that if you give it away for free, you're giving away a people's resource that companies are going to make money off of for free, right? Which is, the U.S. has only gone through this open data sea change, right, over the last couple decades, or particularly, civic data. And there's a certain logic and sense. You wouldn't want the Amman municipality giving away buildings for free, right? Why give away informational, data sets that they've spent money accumulating? So basically, they would give us data in inverse proportion to how valuable they thought it was, right? Like they gave me all the street lights in Amman just because I asked for it, because they were like, well, who wants street lights? And I was like, I do, I'm a transportation nerd. But then house numbers, that's something they can sell, or they think they can sell. I don't actually know if they sell it or not, but it's something they want to sell. And then the much bigger problem is no one uses street names in Amman.
The streets actually have signs.
The streets do have signs. As of this more recent development that Imam, maybe sometime last 20 years or so, they put up signs, they put up house numbers, but just no one uses them. Except for a few major streets that are basically, centers unto themselves, almost neighborhoods, right? Someone would say that street. But otherwise, I lived for a year on one street that I just didn't know the name of, right? And I remember some friend from America came and visited, and they're like, how do you not know your street name? I was like, no one uses street names. How do you navigate if you don't use street names? Well, you use neighborhood and landmarks, right? You don't say, go meet me on 23 Bass Ave. You say, go meet me at Central Square near the Starbucks, right? And even we do that all the time because that provides a lot of context, right? The more time I spent with street names and numbers, the less I liked them as I started thinking about them as imprecise ways to have precision, right? I mean, if I just tell you, go to Mass Ave, right? If I'm like, Wendy, let's hang out later on Mass Ave. You're like, well, what does that mean, right? That's not nearly enough. All right, let's hang out at 3500 Mass Ave. Okay, well, where's that too, right? Then you have to look it up on your phone, and all of a sudden you need something else to help you decode what that means. And it was one of the things I got to appreciate, which is to some degree, reading between the actions of what the municipality's been doing, they're trying to push a street number, street name kind of agenda, right? They're putting up street numbers and names, they're trying to get people to use it. And I'm just thinking, why? Right? I mean, I think people currently don't use them. They don't really need to use them. And with GPS and coordinates, you can just leapfrog the need for them, right? I mean, a famous example says about having cell phones instead of landlines, right? In certain countries, can kind of just jump the need to have landlines. Now that I can send you my GPS coordinates, we have a way to be really precise if we need to be really precise. But if we want to provide the context, let's go with neighborhoods and landmarks. So all these open trip planners and the kind of stuff that's out there is really developed around roads and lines. I mean, that's how they're built. They say turn right on this street. They want you to put in an address, 34 such and such street. We're all GIS people. We started thinking about, rather than just lines, how can we use points, lines, and polygons together to provide richer directions, to provide directions that perhaps are more useful, more intuitive to people using them. So points would be landmarks and points of interest. The street networks, the lines, right? Those are still there. Those still have a place for sure. And then polygons, we started thinking about, well, if people want neighborhoods, that's actually not that hard to do, right? To give people directions by neighborhood. I went on Wikimapia. I don't know if anyone knows this. It's sort of, pretty fun. And in Amman, actually rather well-developed crowdsourced platform. And people have put in neighborhood boundaries. Now, neighborhoods are a really subjective concept. There's an awesome Boston map by Andy Woodruff, who's a great cartographer, where you can go in and draw a Boston neighborhood if you want, or Cambridge neighborhood, and you'll see thousands of people have done it and no one agrees, right? I mean, where does Central Square end and Harvard Square begin? It's entirely subjective. In Amman, it's still subjective, but Amman has a lot of hills. It's made up of these jebel, these hills that actually provide a certain geographic idea of what that neighborhood is, because it's the neighborhood on that hill. But it's still up for debate. But we were able to pull all these neighborhoods and start incorporating it into the trip planner. So now we have the street name and the neighborhood where it is, right? And that just gives a little bit more context. It's not how the open trip planner comes out of the box, but you can put it in pretty easily. You can also select a location by neighborhood, right? So take me to such and such a neighborhood. Now is adding point level. So first you say, take me to this neighborhood. And then you'll get an option of various landmarks in that neighborhood. And then you say, now take me to the, near that landmark. And that just seems to kind of work. I mean, everything requires more data. But as technically it works, and conceptually, it seems actually to cohere a little bit better than try to force the street-based direction system. One other thing we've been trying to do is, so Amman has no fixed stops, but the government put in a bunch of benches, maybe 7 years ago, that provide a little shade. Amman's pretty hot. A little shade, you get somewhere to sit as you're waiting for the bus, which is great. And that's also a data set they shared with us. They gave us all the benches. Again, no one's going to buy benches from them, so they give us all the benches. And part of what we want to show is, let's show that if you give value, if you give data to the open tech community, they'll turn it into something valuable. So one of the things I was working on a couple weeks ago is the green dots here are simulated, fake stops. These are GTFS stops that kind of march along every 200 meters. And the purple are the benches. This is in a part of the city that has a lot of benches. And just wrote a little program to check to see if one of our simulated stops had a bench nearby. And if there was, pull the stop over to be on the same location as the bench, and then encode in our GTFS, this is a place with a bench. So that now when you pull out the trip planner, we can add a little thing that says, walk 100 meters to your right and you'll be able to sit down. There's a bench there. And this idea is most people who actually use the trip planner, but it also really helps, it shows the government, they just had these benches lying around, kind of one of those tree falls in a forest. If no one knows it's there, are people going to use it? But now with the trip planner, you can direct people to use the bench and help people out and get a little more value. Yeah. So I've sat. There's these grand hills in Amman, and as you're walking up one of those hills, sometimes park it with the bench. Oh, also Jeff helped me get elevation data for Amman, which is really nice because our trip planner does factor in elevation. Because before you told me where to get some good elevation data, the trip planner was sending people like, oh, the shortest way to get there is up this giant hill and down the other side, and that's really not pleasant.
So with no bus stops, then you hail a bus?
You hail a bus, yeah. So you just
see the bus, you go out.
Yep. And to get off, you just say, Galafia, thank you. I'm getting off. You can tap a coin against the window, and get on, get off.
Yeah. Same with the other smaller transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's the really small taxis can just fill up, so you can't always count on if a taxi's passing you, it'll have a spot. But if it does, it'll usually pull over and pick you up.
So say you want to go to your friend's house across town. Mm-hmm. How would they communicate that if addresses really aren't used? Would they say intersection or landmark?
Yeah, so most of Amman's intersections are circles, and they'll say the circle. They'll go to 8th circle or go to this circle, and they'll say, and then there's the grocery store that's kind of down the hill, and I'm 2 streets past that.
And that's what the taxi drivers will understand as well.
Yeah, and you do that when you get in a taxi here too, right? I mean, sometimes you might say, take me to, what's the address of our center, something, Cambridge Street?
1737.
1737. You might say 1737 Cambridge Street to a taxi driver. More likely, you'd say Harvard Yard, and then once you got closer, right, you kind of you delve down into specificity. And also, I mean, one of the apartments I lived in, that's the actual address was behind the post office, and that's I mean, there are a bunch of addresses that qualify, but that's how you would tell people where to find you.
I looked on the OpenStreetMap wiki.
Yeah.
And I think almost all of this was done from satellite imagery. There's exactly one user and a bunch of GPS traces that say walked around Petra.
Yep.
And that's it.
There's more than one user. I don't know which level you're looking at, but there aren't that many more. And a lot of it seems to be imported from Bing. Interesting enough, on OpenStreetMap you can put a source, and a lot of times it says from Bing. So it looks like people are tracing Bing satellite imagery and then saying from Bing.
Is there, do you think? So is there reluctance to participate in that sort of thing?
Interesting. So I read a great blog post of an OpenStreetMap team 7 or 8 years ago that went to Jordan. They got 4 or 5 people together. They were going to go do a big mapping effort, try and train a bunch of people. And the government was actually pretty hostile when they found out the OpenStreetMap includes military installations. And Jordan is a very security-minded place for good reason. And in fact, we had one of our volunteers get picked up by the secret police, and they were brought in for a couple hours because the secret police had heard there were people asking questions about public transportation. And that's the kind of thing they're going to go follow up on. So sometimes the concerns are security. Oftentimes they're more commercial. There'll be groups that have data, and they can sell that data, but only if it's scarce. And so then there are other groups that'll help make sure that data is scarce. But then there's also really vibrant. I mean, you go on Wikimapia, it's just full of everyone put their their backyard and their neighbor's house and their street on, and there's definitely both sets of interest.
Don't you think that the military will have?
The Amman government has an incredible amount of data. I mean, I've literally sat with people and watched them open data sets with just my eyes popping out of my head at what we could do if they made that open. They're a regulatory / security state. They have data on everything. I saw one data set that just has every registered business in Amman, right? So just like, it's like every bakery, right? And there's dozens of bakeries, and every hospital and dozens of hospitals. And as a public transportation person, I'm thinking you could have such a deep understanding of the city if you made that public, because you could see, well, who has better access to healthcare and who doesn't, right? Who, but
But they must have some sort of mapping things, because they're always, if they have such a tight security system, military, they must have some sort of mapping of this, because they always
do.
know how to follow.
They absolutely do. Yeah, they have GIS departments and GIS practitioners. I've worked with some of them. I mean, they're really knowledgeable. They know what they're doing. They just keep all the data in-house. They keep it all closed. So they have, one of the things I heard as I was doing this project is there isn't data. That's just not true. There's a tremendous amount. It's just not open. And there's also a fair amount of geographic skill. I mean, there's a lot of good GIS people who are employed by a variety of government institutions, but again, kept it in-house for a variety of reasons. So last 2 slides, just go back to this relationships, data, software question. Like I started out as one guy who knew nothing about software, was only doing a little bit. Really, the project took off as we found these overlapping interests, right? This public transportation advocacy group, this design firm, the government, the people within it that support us, trying to find these converging places where everyone wants to work together is a really big part of this project. And the latest thing is there are similar projects going on in Beirut and Cairo. There's a group called Transport for Cairo and a group called Bus Map Project Beirut it's been great talking with the last couple months, because we're able to share really similar situations, right? I mean, similar governmental ideas about data, similar issues of how people navigate and how do you use a trip planner made for streets. We've started up an email group, and now we're starting to do monthly Skype sessions, and it's also just been really valuable because we get to learn from them and share ideas. It just goes back to this, we're much stronger the stronger relationships we have as these kind of little grassroots mapping efforts. So long list of people to thank from all the organizations I've been a part of, and also the greater kind of mapping tech community of which you guys are a part of, and which Wendy, Ben, Jeff, want to thank you guys in particular for helping me out this year. I knew nothing about GIS a year and a couple months ago. Took a lot of online courses, and then would bend some people's ears and get advice along the way. So thank you for help on that front.
So you said that there are only 3 different kind of transportation. Is there anything like Uber?
Yeah.
I mean, not official, but
so Uber officially launched in like my last month of being there. They had a big launch of 4 cars. They started out just with 4 cars, just to kind of navigate things. Sorry, just
that's official, but then aren't there people who actually work, but then they just pick up people?
Yeah. So both, definitely. There's a huge transportation system. Just to close the Uber thought, Uber really grew until about 2 weeks ago when Amman put the kibosh on Uber. They started arresting drivers, impounding cars for violating taxi licensing regulations. But there's a huge informal transport system. I mean, I used to live in the suburbs of Amman. The buses were always so packed. The easiest way to get in was just to thumb a ride, and then you'd give someone $50 for bringing you into the city. And people make a lot of their gas and commute money just bringing people in and out. That's someone just going to work. Then there's also more regular informal people who really they just have an unmarked van and they'll pull up and pick you up. Our project didn't even go into that level. We stuck with the official system, and it's really part of the picture. And that informal system thrives again because when you're broken systems, people are going to figure out a way to get around one way or another.
So that's not something that if the government finds you giving rides to people for money, they're not going to stop you, right?
No, they will. Yeah.
They will.
Yeah. I mean, it probably depends on the person and the officer, but there's often like you get fined. There can be. Yeah.
So there would be danger in using an open Uber style app. I mean, presumably all the bus drivers have smartphones.
Yep, and most of them use them while they're driving.
So they
but
could be generating the location feed if you go onto maps.
And the official bus drivers, not the informal people, the official people could probably do it legally. I mean, the official, allowed to operate. But part of the problem is the lack of competition. You get a monopoly to run your route. And so then it kind of goes, well, why put in all this extra effort? The people who are going to ride my route, they have to ride my route. Let me not serve them the best I can. There's a lot of that attitude. Yeah.
It's been a fascinating project to challenge you about a couple times over the past year. Especially given my own experiences with the informal transport system in Egypt, which is much gnarlier. In terms of demonstrating value for this, have you had discussions with any of the companies that run this? Because I can imagine you said there's like 200 to 300. You've got 76. Is there any way to, like, the 76 that are on that route, if they start seeing an increase in revenue, and suddenly all the other people who aren't seeing that bump are getting, jealous and wanting to give you data or get on board somehow?
Yeah, right. Let's put our money where our mouths are, and if this is actually valuable, right? That should. There's one large bus company that has about 25% of the overall bus lines that we keep trying to talk to, wanting to talk to, and it hasn't happened. And we haven't launched the app yet, in part because we want to see if they'll work with us a little bit more, right? And we would love to say things like, if you share your data, right, you can get a bump in our app, right? And we know your bus is reliable, we'll direct people to your bus. Part of the problem is just our limited resources, right? And trying to kind of, what I found with these interpersonal things, they're so valuable and they're so necessary, and they just take a lot of time and talks. So you have to go sit down with people multiple times. That should hopefully be the next level of what we do, which would be real partnerships of let's work together.
You get the impression that the operators think of this as a very static situation. So they have their route, they have their customers who are always on that route and not on other routes. And so sharing information would just create chaos of everybody trying to get everybody else's routes.
Yeah.
Not bring any more.
And some of them already track it. So this biggest bus company, for example, every time a bus leaves, there are these people who I see write down, bus such and such left at this time. And for their own records, they have this rich data where if they shared it, our GTFS would go from being this impressionistic to a real, this is what the frequency is, and here's where it varies. You can pass down a franchise to run a bus from father to son. This is viewed as, this is your property.
Or as in Boston, give the medallion to your wife before you got prison.
Yep, certain public figures. And I do think for other people there's interest, but just not the technical capacity, the time, and that's why we're hoping that if we sort of say, we'll do a lot of this, but just give us those sheets that you've been collecting, right?
Well, I wonder how inaccurate that impression is. Clearly that's the way they think of their business, but if there was information that showed that people were more fluid than that, and there were customers to compete for.
And people, so the Center for the Study of the Built Environment that did a study from the user's perspective is now doing a study from the regulator and operator perspective. It's still ongoing, but one of the things, they just did an interview with someone who said exactly that. He said, my users know where my bus is, right? And that's a very static concept, right? It doesn't say I could get more users if, right? It says, my users know. And that's not inaccurate. The people who take your line every day, they do know how to get in. They probably don't need a map. But yeah, the idea of this could really be good for you, you could collect more, is something that, again, I think is the challenge for us. We have to prove that.
I thought it was really interesting that you had to deal with the issue about the unregulated, no schedule, no official stops nature of this, and that you came up with this great idea of just focusing on, for example, neighborhoods and landmarks as like destination points and so on. And for me, that's really interesting. Also, it made me think that another potential application for this is digital humanities and cultural heritage. So I know right now you're very focused on this like GTFS and where are the buses, and like you're very into this whole process of the relationship to be established. But the potential for this is also really good for cultural heritage in the sense that now you set up this framework of all of these potential trips around the city. And for people who wanted to layer saying like, oh yeah, the history of this neighborhood is really rich because this landmark has this information about it and these stories about it and these famous figures who live here, and so on. Lots of layers to put.
Absolutely. One of my favorite parts of that is with landmarks specifically. Every now and then you come across a neighborhood that's really known by a landmark or a landmark that's really important that's no longer there, right? But that restaurant or that grocery store, right, was a huge part of the community for 50 years, and now it's gone, and people still use it, right? I mean, that's still the name there, and that is a rich part of your history that is being preserved and transmitted, right? I mean, it's kept alive in a lot of ways. This would be a way of.
The reason I mention it is because one of the issues that Josh was just talking about is buy-in. Like, what is the benefit? What's the buy-in for any of these people to provide better information or get involved in improving this whole system that you're developing? Well, everybody has very strong feelings about their cultural heritage and literary or historical significance of where they live. And that's kind of the point of a buy-in there, that the users and the providers of the system.
Yeah.
For example, the guy whose route does not have all the traffic, but it's like where the most famous author.
Yeah, totally.
But also, if there is a revolution or something in that country, all these names are going to change of the street names. So you'll be left with all different. But so if you have this polygon thing, so that
The neighborhoods and points of interest aren't going to change
those
so
will
fast.
stay, but the
That's
street
perfect.
names will be all gone.
Totally. And already the official name, for example, the circles, what I know as Duwar Thani second circle has some official name that's like, King Abdullah circle. No one uses, right? That's not.
Yeah, so someone else comes in.
That's
Someone takes his place.
So if this actually happens, we've heard sayings, you build it, they will come. So, okay, so you build this app and like what we have here, you know when the bus is coming. That means could be tens, hundreds of people who show up at that spot for that bus. What are the implications for that? And then maybe there's no infrastructure and money to grow the bus system. That's a problem.
That is
I think.
one of the good problems. Yeah, that's a problem for sure. But that and
I wonder if that's
There-
having any impact.
there are real supply constraints on the number of buses. For example, that biggest bus company just doesn't. There are some routes that just need more buses, and they don't have the money to buy, a new fleet. There are real problems, capacity problems. Part of the idea also behind the full picture, and it's hard to change any system like this, but there's an incredible amount of redundancy. I mean, routes that have so much of the same route for such a high percentage. And again, this is really hard to do, and I don't think it's going to happen, but you could improve the system through using that information to do things like reduce redundancies and increase frequency. It's hard to do, and so I don't know if that's holding anyone back, because I think that's the kind of problem the bus operators would want to have, right? They would want to have their buses be too full, than to be only 50% full, but. That's definitely that next level planning discussion, which is, well, then where do we get the money to buy 100 more buses? Yeah, for sure.
Again, on the subject of sort of stakeholders and buy-in, this is maybe many sit-down discussions and tea sessions down the road, but I can imagine in Amman where the national government's priority is jobs, growth, development, especially since they've hyped up the tech sector so much in the country. Is there any buy-in from developers or some entrepreneurs or startups to get transportation out to sections of the city where the real estate prices aren't so incredibly high? Just because I know the central areas like Double Lefto, where you have all the NGO organizations moving in, prices have gotten pretty ridiculous. But at the same time, I'm sure there's lots of developers who'd like consumers and employees to be able to get out to outlying areas where there are malls, shopping areas, and office space available.
Yeah, I wish I had a better understanding of the housing market and real estate prices, of both developers and the constraints they face. I could absolutely imagine a harmonious, mutually supportive way in which real estate and transportation could develop hand in hand. It's not something I know much about, but those are the kind of things that would be great to see. Yeah.
Ordinary people riding buses use using Flickr
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
a lot.
Absolutely.
I wonder if if they use it a lot, then based on Twitter data can give you for the ones who turn on the GPS.
Yeah.
You could extract those moving users by their speed, meaning that if it's faster than walking and slower than driving a private car, chances are they might be on a bus.
Yep.
And by aggregating those, doesn't matter what they're tweeting about, the content isn't important, but the time and the location coming from the same user could give you the bus route.
All right, Wendy, you're hired. Come on board. No, absolutely, totally. One of the things we have currently, and this is very much a work in progress app, but one of the things we have currently is the ability to add information. So we have a little help contribute to the app, and it's how long did you wait for the bus today? And we debated back and forth having the app itself, because you could use Twitter data, which would be great, and you can even do it directly with having the app. If you turn on your GPS, it'll record that information. We probably aren't going to do that because the developers think that just people don't like having their location tracked, and so that would hurt the efficacy of the app. But yeah, I think.
Or if you just give them a complaint app.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Just saying, I'm waiting for the bus for too long. I'm going to fire up this app and tell them that this is the problem.
Yeah, or a complaint Twitter account and say, tweet with your location, right?
Yeah.
And we'll
something like that.
Yeah,
But what I was talking about isn't active contribution.
yeah,
It's a
just get the
passive analysis.
tweets and then look them. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And these are the kind of things that make this project so fun. Is you're trying to take ore and find gold, right? And see what can you have out there, what can you piece together. The Amman government has 500 government vehicles that they have GPS trackers on. We're trying to get that just to get traffic speeds, right? The kind of things that Google and Waze have, but we would love to have for free. And just trying to figure out.
The problem with using Twitter, though, is that you can't really make it anonymous. But if your app made send anonymous location information, it would be more like Waze, and you would have to develop that trust. But you'd say, we're not transmitting your location; we're just transmitting your, the location and speed as an anonymous data point. You could do a lot with that, while maybe worrying people less that they would.
Except they never use their video or anything else you can find it with. There are other ways to identify.
Right, but there's levels of privacy, so not having your account attached directly to the points on there is a little.
Getting that trust, and it's doable. It's a challenge. One of the ideas we've had is when the app comes out, if we have a location tracker part, can we get drivers to keep the app on? Right? Could we get the operators of companies to ask their drivers or say, put the app on so people know where your bus is right now?
You just, there's this middle ground between providing your
everything
information and the fact that the government has all of the cell phone locations all the time. Their account information. So there's a level of trust somewhere in there. That's your relationship, is understanding what you're
The tracker option would be great because then you could actually feed it out live as a stream to GTFS.
Yep. Yeah, there's real-time GTFS, which gives you the current location of vehicles. And
traffic, right?
Yep. Most. Boston has a real-time GTFS feed. Most cities these days have
Putting out this one in Germany called Travic.
Travic.
TRAVIC. And they just serve as it's a software user interface that will pull any live designated GTFS feed into live.
Great. Yeah.
So you don't have to build it.
That's wonderful. Check it out. Travic. Great.
I kind of wonder what unintended consequences putting this information together has, which you may never know. Could be maybe too little. Maybe 10 years, there's a sign for the route, 200 meters, at every spot down the street to mark where you created your GPS. That's because that's where the route stops, or these kind of unintended things that by being the publisher of this information.
Let's
You
make
know.
the stops permanent.
You know, you kind of engineer a future that you didn't intend.
There was
You'll get freaked out when you
There-
start seeing bus stops at those points.
well, so there was no, this came up in our group where there were people who said, rather than doing the simulated approach, why don't we just put our stops where the benches are?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was against that idea. I didn't want to do passive social engineering, right? I want to say people use the bus in this fashion, and I want this to help them use it in the way they currently use it, rather than trying to do the nudges and change. But you could, and then there were people in our group who said, no, our goal should be to push for a better system, and one of the ways is showing that if the bus doesn't stop every 200 meters, it goes faster, and thus let's push people to walk a little farther. And it's, you know, it's a good debate to have. I came down on the side of I don't think that's our role or in the best interest of the app, because I think we should make it natural and easy to use. And if people go, I have to walk all the way, like why don't I just stay here? But yeah, it's I mean, unintended or intended. Yeah, there are lots of ways that this could not have the way impact you'd want it to have, or have unsurprisingly good impacts. Yeah.
Well, that you have a good reason to keep the way it is, but what I'm thinking is that even though they are simulated stops, you might want to simulate it towards human behavior. For example, instead of putting them every 200 feet, meticulous, put it where the nearest intersection to that point.
Yep.
Snap it to, you know, so that's more likely people would want to get off or get on. Of course, if there's no intersection within 200 feet, then I don't know, 200 meter, however you want it.
Yeah, and I really should do that. I haven't yet. One of the reasons being it seems to work out that it has crossed a lot of intersections, but I should formalize it. I mean, if you see, you do end up getting a lot of stops. I don't know if that's because of how long intersections are and how the space is.
Or it just happens to be there. I mean,
there is an option in Geonda GTFS to snap it to OpenStreetMap intersections. I don't think I activated that, but it still worked out. But I should. You're absolutely right. I mean, no, for sure. That's a great one.
60 or 70%.
Yeah, but that's a great thought. I should go home right now and do that, because that's the kind of helpful thing that people would like, particularly because when you transfer buses, right? I mean, you're transferring at that intersection. Yeah, that would be incredibly helpful.
So on the app, so it's a trip planning app.
Yeah.
Right? You put in where you are, where you want to go.
Yeah.
Gives you the route, gives you the bus lines. But it doesn't tell you when the bus is going to come.
Yeah, and part of the problem is behind the scenes. It's assuming certain things about when the bus is coming, because the GTFS has to have a schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So behind the scenes, it assumes the bus has certain speeds and times that are really shaky, and we're just using that behind the scenes to give you a route and then not showing you the information because we don't actually have good enough information to show.
Right, and so what I'm getting at is that information.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the government is not motivated to have all their bus operators with GPS on their bus and feed it.
Yeah.
Is that the case?
Yeah.
And then the bus operators probably too numerous to try and get them to do that. Try the bus drivers, like you mentioned. What about the riders, though? You get on the bus, you say, I'm on this route, and then that feed gets fed to everyone else who's waiting for a bus.
Yeah.
And you're the tracker for that
Yeah.
bus. Has that thought come up?
Waze has a sister company called Move It that tries to do sort of Waze for public transportation. That's their model. And yeah, I mean, that's one of the things.
WAZE.
Yeah, WAZE has this other company, Move It. And that's a really effective approach. You have to get buy-in with trust, as we were talking about. And then for the moment, we're not going with that because our developers think that the GPS tracking option is not something most people want. But if we put it as an optional thing, contribute to the app by turning on your GPS right now, even just a little bit of information would go a long way. I mean, even if it wasn't a full network,
To get buy-in, you should promote people going to places like Boston that have these great tracker apps where you can see where all the buses are at one moment and realize how convenient that is.
Yeah, it really is.
And one more question about, you said, for Google Maps, transit routes that don't have GTFS aren't included.
Yeah.
And that's just in the transportation option when you do directions in Google.
Yeah.
That's not on the base map.
Yeah, just
Would
the,
the Google base map still have bus stops that might not have a GTFS feed? Or
yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to see. Yeah, I haven't looked at that question. The Digital Matatu's Nairobi group did this amazing thing where in order to get their data up on Google, which also it has to be GTFS and you have to be a government agency. That's a second requirement of theirs. So our group, even if we had a perfect GTFS, they wouldn't work with us. Digital Matatu's, which is this MIT, Columbia, Nairobi consortium, incorporated as a company just so they could have like a liability shield, which then Google would accept because Google, if you give it wrong transit information, doesn't want to be sued. So now Nairobi stuff is on there because they set up a whole company just to get their data up on Google. It's another interesting thing where I had all these people in Amman. They think the fact that Amman's public transportation info isn't on Google is their fault sometimes. Like our city is doing something wrong. Kind of, but also like Google puts certain barriers, right? They want it in a certain format. They need certain people to work with. Yeah, but it's a good question or a good thought on if the stops are there because we might be able to add them in, and we can certainly add them in on OpenStreetMap. Add the bus benches and stuff. Just do it ourselves.
well, thanks again for speaking.
Thank you, and thanks for it's been a great year. So thanks for being wonderful colleagues and interlocutors. Yeah,
So let us know when you put this app online.
yeah, and everyone should go. I mean, you gotta be in Amman to use it, but I'll let you.
No, it would be the browser, right? I mean, not that we'll use it for real, but
Yeah.
we'll be able to see it.
Yeah, absolutely, and you can scroll over to Amman if you need to and put in some locations and try it
We'll
out.
highlight your app.
Blog from our website.
Yeah, I think I'll try to build a special Boston to Amman. Just slip something in OpenStreetMap where there's a tunnel. And then,
Did you talk to Ben? Because he went to Amman.
yeah, because
His son was there.
so that's how I met Ben. That's how I learned about the
That's how
center.
you became affiliated
I knew
with
Rohan
CNA.
in Amman.
You ran into Rohan.
We were both at the Center for the Study of the Built Environment, which was one of the groups involved. Yeah.
And for me, it's good to know about that Center for the Built Environment because there's